Thanks, Christy, for having me on and everyone else setting this up. My name's Kyle Okke. I am a Winfield United agronomist, like Christy said. I cover North Dakota, northwestern Minnesota, and the eastern half of Montana. And so I live in western North Dakota, been here for quite a few years now. I grew up actually in a farm in the Red River Valley in Minnesota, where my family raised anything from, well, still do, sugar beets, wheat, corn, dry beans, potatoes. A little different from what you guys do farther west, but have a lot of experience with those different crops. But I'm here today to talk about wheat. And I know that wheat production for you guys is a lot different than wheat production that we normally do here in North Dakota, Montana. Now, our yields typically range anywhere from, I'd say, an average of 50 bushels an acre, which is probably considered a crop failure depending on where you are and if it's a winter spring type. But predominantly we're spring types, and you get into central Montana and we do more winters. But regardless that there are big yield differences, I hope you can pull some parallels and you can pull some of this crop production information I'm going to share and take it home with you. So really the talk I'm giving today is managing wheat by the acre, and it's just using precision management tools that you have to your disposal and how you could actually be more profitable with those. So, this kind of starts simple, but, wheat management by the acre. I think we all think now, yeah, duh, these are, this is how we do things now with all the variable rate technology and all that we have. But, where I really want to focus is that we have varieties, population, fertility, and fungicides, and how those all can play into a precision management type strategy, because they all have their own way that we can manage those by the acre. And so this all really starts by identifying variability. So like I said, we're going to start really simple, but first, when you're identifying variability, you just have to have the tools to find that there's variability there. And so using NDVI images are absolutely the best way to get started with this. And you can see just on all NDVI maps, where I'm just kind of running here with the laser pointer, you can see a scale of how variable fields are. So we see here that there's essentially almost a 60% change in variability in this field. So we know that, for this entire field, this is something that we probably need to manage by the acre and not by an entire field basis. You can take and start to layer in other pieces of information, and if you go back and forth between those two, you're like, okay, I can see there's differences. You can start to overlay those and start to really understand, okay, we have real variability here, so let's decide that this is something that we definitely need to manage on a more granular basis versus a by the field basis. But sometimes you have fields that have no variability at all and could be pancake flat, have one soil type, and those make great examples of places that you can't or you don't necessarily need to be managing by the acre. And so I thought that would be important to share too, because we have plenty of circumstances where sometimes variability doesn't exist. And so it's identifying where that variability is and keying in on that, where you could have the most economical return on managing this way. And so there are other layers of information that'll be out there, things like elevation maps, and it kind of just helps uncover, maybe why some of that variability is there. You guys might laugh because this is only maybe 30 feet of elevation difference, but for central North Dakota, it does make a difference on some of the productivity. Same thing, you can get aspect layers, all that, but these are just all readily available pieces of information that actually come from the R7 tool. Now, there are other sources to get that. if they're yield maps, if they are, say, like a Varus machine, or there's countless other versions. I just wanted to quickly cover that there are many sources of information to get an idea how variable a field is. And so let's say that we land on that this NDVI map really matches well to what we're seeing for yield in the field, which in this particular case, this is a field I work with, and this NDVI image actually really matches well with the yield we get in the field. So this is kind of what I want to share and build into this. So here's a generalized yield map from this particular field. This is just 3 years ago. But you can see in these different zones, here are the yield averages. Or excuse me, these are just the acres on here, but let's look at a scenario. So for us, it's pretty common to flat apply nitrogen for 60 bushels an acre, and generally we'll get that 60 bushels an acre. Just some baseline things so you guys understand where we're coming from on fertility. This might be different from you, but generally our nitrogen credit is in the 20s to 30s most years, but our yield goal is always 2.5 bushels of nitrogen per bushel yield goal minus those N credits. And so 120 pounds of nitrogen, or units of nitrogen, were applied flat across the field. And just based on a 42 cents per pound of urea. So that's just building the scenario. So look at this here for yield. Here's what we actually got for yield on this field. In those red zones, we were seeing 35 bushels, and all the way in some of the best zones, we were seeing up to 92 bushels an acre. Or excuse me, 90 bushels an acre. And really what the difference was in this field is that we had a really, it was a very shallow soil, very sandy, doesn't hold any water. And so it just doesn't produce well. And then we get into this, some of the darkest, blackest soil that I've seen, where you can put a 2-foot probe in and you're still just reaching black dirt here. But anyways, if we start looking at how we applied this nitrogen, and we start looking at that we were applying a 60 bushel an acre yield goal rate across the entire field. And now let's look at that we're over applying nitrogen in some of these zones that we weren't really getting our return back on that. And then in some cases, we were actually getting, a better nitrogen use efficiency in those different areas of the field. And so when you start to put dollars on that, you start to see that there gets to be some overspend in some of those areas. And so what we typically do, because protein is such an important component to not only just for yield, but protein is also important to us, we'll typically start to shift those dollars into those better zones. Because what happens in these zones is that we get the yield out of them, but where we start to suffer is in quality. And so when we start to move our nitrogen dollars in this direction, not only do we see yield increases, we are seeing some major quality differences too in the protein content in the grain that we actually are receiving in those zones. And so, just some things we've done in the past. These are back in my earlier days, but we would always do these variable rate trials, and we'd be working with farmers, and we would actually have variable rate nitrogen applied across the field, and then we would put their static check. So we'd get across all those productivity zones where this would be that essentially that 60 bushel per acre nitrogen rate. And then we actually matched nitrogen rates with the rest of the field. So the majority of the time we had really good response rates, and without even looking into the quality aspect of it, we were always seeing a nice little yield advantage, and we were spending the exact same amount of money on nitrogen, just reallocating where those nitrogen dollars went. So anyways, just building into this precision management thing. So as we're getting into fertility management, what causes soil to be variable? It could be different levels of organic matter. It could be topography, which I'm sure is a huge player for you guys. It could be soil pH, which I know is becoming more important for us, and soil texture. And they're all related, actually, in a lot of ways. But how do we collect this information? So there, like I said, there's a multitude of ways. It could be things like running an electroconductivity sensor machine like a Varus toolbar, and developing a map which can actually do a few things. Those tools, you could record organic matter, you could find pH, you can find EC. So there's a lot of layers of information you can pull from these. It could be things like satellite imagery that are developing NDVI maps, like what I was showing you earlier in the R7 tool. It could be aerial imagery, or in our case, this is where we got a lot of our elevation data, was from LiDAR maps from being flown. And then really ultimately in the end, it's yield data. That's really going to help tell you where you have variability in the field. So you have to start with a way to build zones, and you use this kind of information. And so I'm not going to get into how you take this information and build it into zones, but just that you have all this to your disposal to build those kind of productivity zone maps. And so once you have it, then you have your baseline. You have your zone map you want to use, and you build a soil test plan. You know, and these don't have to be overly complicated. Generally, what a lot of us do here are soil sample generally be 5 to 7 zone maps, and we will generally soil test the 3 zones in there. So we'll go from the worst to something that kind of hits in the middle, and then to the best areas. And then we can interpolate results. And mostly we're looking at nitrogen when we're looking at these zone maps. So soil testing is definitely your big start to this, but also tissue sampling can uncover a lot of really important pieces of information too. And so I thought this is important to share, because you guys have, I want to say close to 3,000 samples just taken in the last 2 to 3 years from both your soft white wheats and your hard red wheats. And so there's a lot of information that comes out of that. So I thought that would kind of start a micronutrient conversation eventually, but just so you guys see too. So the last, I guess 2017 through 2020 would be what, 4 years. But you kind of get an idea of where on your different classes of wheat, you know, where your micronutrient issues may be. And so I'm seeing, you know, chloride, which is something that we deal with too. And that's just generally relates to coarser soil texture, sandier soils. Copper, which is one we see a lot. Magnesium is not one we see too much, but zinc and boron. So for the sake of micronutrients, I'll probably cover copper, zinc, boron, so I don't go too far into this. But I thought this interesting too. Nitrogen and sulfur, although either adequate or excessive here, I think are they're still important for discussion, because they're definitely big management pieces. And so hopefully there's some parallels you can pull from what I have to discuss there. And then this manganese piece, I'm not sure what your guys' soil pHs are that you're seeing, but one thing that we're definitely seeing in Western North Dakota is that our manganese levels are starting to do this more and more. We used to never see soil test levels in any of our crops, or excuse me, plant tissue samples in any of our crops is high. But now we're starting to see this excessive and more than adequate, and it's actually an indicator of acidifying soil pH. So I'm not sure if that's what you guys are seeing in your own respective areas, but I know that that's definitely something that we're seeing, and this excessive and inadequate keeps increasing as time goes. And so hard red wheat, just a little different look, but very close to the same, where copper, boron, zinc kind of all have the same place here, but this magnesium piece shows a deficient more. So anyways, We'll get into a little micronutrient conversation a little bit further down, but this is kind of where I want to focus on fertility. Just starting with nitrogen, looking at actual nitrogen nutrient ratios, because I think they're important. So even though we're excessive in these or adequate in these where we think we have these covered, I think just pointing out keeping these in an appropriate ratio would actually keep your production humming along a lot better than just saying things are good. I think you can fine tune just by looking at your tissue samples, and I'll show that in a little bit. And then I have some micro stuff to cover. So, you know, nitrogen in a really simple fact comes in two different forms. So if you're applying urea or ammonia, it's first going to be converted into this ammonium form, and then it will convert to nitrate. But as far as the sake of this conversation goes, you know, nitrate, mobile in the soil because it has the same charge as the soil colloids, and ammonium has an opposite charge, and so it'll stick to the soil. And so nitrogen's eventual fate is either leaching, where that ammonium gets converted to by soil bacteria to nitrate, and with soil water can leach. And there's the other fate, that's volatility. So your applied urea on the soil surface, you have urease doing its job, that converts it to ammonia gas initially. And if you don't have either incorporation into the ground, or you don't have enough irrigation or actual rain to incorporate that, you can start to see that gas off. But eventually, if you have enough soil water, then that'll attach to that, convert to ammonia, and stay in the soil. But where I want to talk is this volatility piece. So ways we can inhibit urea volatility. So, you know, here's just kind of a list 1 through 5, most important to, you know, they're all effective measures, but most effective to least effective in that group. And the biggest is just incorporating urea down to 2 inches of soil or more. And that be mechanically, if you have that ability, if you are tilling, or by rain or irrigation, is to get that into the soil that deep. And if it's irrigation or rain, generally, if you get a 1/2 inch of water, that is generally enough to incorporate that deep enough where you do not see volatility losses. But then if you're actually in a dry land situation and you're applying urea, it's going to sit on the surface and you're at the mercy of the weather, then there's possibilities you can, in no-till person, you know, there's 2 active ingredients you really want to look at. And so that's NBPT, so which is what's in your Agrotane and all those different brands of Agrotane and all the different private labels that they have there. There's a new one, and I'm not sure if this is something that's labeled in your guys' region, but it's NBPT plus Duramide. It's called Anvol. It comes from Coke, excuse me, the people who make Agrotane. So I'll show a little data on that. DCD has worked good, but only in the form of Super U. Generally, you can't get enough of this onto urea if it's its own set-aside product. Generally, you have to be, it's like 1% of volume as DCD. So if you're adding a product, it'd be far too wet if you had your own DCD standalone products. This is where like the product Super U, the blue urea that comes from Coke, works well. And then ammonium thiosulfate, if you're using a liquid nitrogen source, has proven to reduce volatility to some level. You know, and so here's just an idea on that. So this is what you're seeing on this graph is ammonia loss and then days after application. And so you have your original point of application and you have just 28% UAN. And so you get to see your baseline, what's your volatility as time goes. If you're actually adding something like Agrotane, you know, now you're starting to see where you have great reductions in volatility over time. You still don't reduce all of it, but you have good reduction. But here's your ammonium thiosulfate, and then this is also calcium thiosulfate. I don't know if that's a common fertilizer source for you guys, but it isn't for us. Most of the time we're using ammonium thiosulfate. So just a little piece of data for you guys. But here's that anvil. And so we got to see back here how this agrotane, or this NBPT active ingredient, does as far as inhibiting volatility. Now here's another piece of information. This comes from actually somewhere in South America that Koch did this work. But you get to see over time how urea will volatilize, and then what that NBPT is doing by itself, and then that addition to duramide is reducing that even more as time goes. And so essentially, when you put these things on, you're getting roughly 7 days before you see a really spike in volatility. So it's buying you some time to get a rain event or an irrigation or whatever it is to work that into the ground. So here's just a way, and this is something I'll share with farmers just to try to get them to understand this a little better. So looking at 1 and 2 weeks after a urea application for that same 120 pounds of nitrogen. And so on the bottom, you can see kind of our figures there. But let's just say you put out naked urea, and at 7 days, based on that data I shared earlier, that you're getting a 15% loss of nitrogen. So here's what you're seeing. You're losing $7.50 in just your nitrogen investment and volatility, but where that works out to in actual yield loss is $32.50 roughly. So if you're adding a volatility inhibitor, then we're seeing much less loss. And even though you still see some losses, you're losing far less. But as we get into 14 days after, we can see how this really starts to compound, and you're losing more money in your nitrogen investment and more potential loss in yield. And so really, by adding those volatility inhibitors, you're really helping yourself minimize your losses and keeping your nitrogen actually, from basically floating off into the air as a gas, and keeping that to where the wheat can actually use it. So this will in the end help with yield and quality. So not fun, the nitrogen piece, the nutrient ratios. I just share this, it's complicated, but it's that Mulder's chart just showing there's a lot of nutrient interactions that go on, and there's a lot of them that one nutrient inhibits the other, and there's some that actually synergize each other. So where I kind of want to focus here is nitrogen, sulfur, nitrogen, potassium. We may cover this just what excessive nitrogen does to copper and why we may see that copper shows up either responsive or deficient in a big amount of samples. Same thing with zinc and phosphorus. If you put a lot of phosphorus out without any zinc, it inhibits zinc. If you put a lot of zinc out, it inhibits phosphorus uptake. So there's a lot of nutrient interactions happen, but I want to spend more time talking right here. And so really what we're looking at is nitrogen to sulfur ratio. It shows that, just like us, you guys farther out west with your wheat classes are doing a really good job with nitrogen. Either you're adequate or excessive. It's the same exact picture for us. But where we start to tune in is looking at these ratios. And so essentially 15:1 is considered your ideal nitrogen to sulfur ratio, where you have 15 parts nitrogen to 1 part sulfur. So if you start to get out of that range and say you're getting 16:1 or 20 or 30:1, which happens sometimes, then this is where the addition of sulfur would really help. But generally what we're seeing is that we're seeing a type ratio, and this is where we could actually see more nitrogen efficiency, or excuse me, where we can see a bigger boost from adding nitrogen. So if you have a tighter ratio, so say in this case, you have a 7.6 parts nitrogen to 1 part sulfur, you could actually add nitrogen in this case. In a lot of circumstances, you're going to see a real good response to your nitrogen application. So N to K ratios, very similar. That kind of ideal range is supposed to be that 1.6 to 1 parts nitrogen to potassium. So again, very similar to the sulfur piece. You know, if you're starting to get wider on that range, you'd be adding potassium. If you start to tighten up, you could add nitrogen. And really, what potassium's doing is, I think of it as, it's the water regulation in the plant. And so how nitrogen is getting pulled through the plant is the water that's flowing through the plant, because it's a water mobile nutrient. And potassium is kind of like it's what's causing it to help flow up through the xylem and flow through the plant. And so if you don't have enough of it, you're not going to be able to utilize all the nitrogen you have. And then if you have plenty of it, then you could start to pour on more nitrogen and get more uptake through the plant. So again, it's about the ratio more than it is if you're deficient or not, because I'm assuming, like you guys, we don't have too many deficiency issues with potassium, but more how we play with these ratios. The application timing, I thought I hid that slide. So let's just get right into some of the micronutrient stuff here. So I said I want to talk boron, copper, and zinc for this case. And here we just get an idea on where those applications make the most sense. Where boron, typically you're seeing your best responses later in the season. Copper, although gets used for like protein synthesis and be like pollination things, where they get used later, it seems like the earlier you have that on, it just takes a while for that to move through the plant. So the application time is generally pretty early. And then zinc, I'll explain here in a little bit why zinc is more important early than it is going late. And so just looking at micro is important to wheat. Copper, so if you do see deficiencies, generally it's by the time you get to flag leaf and you get to see this, the flag leaf tip kind of start to pinch off and it gets necrotic. But what we start to see more, and something I don't know if you guys even deal with there, is ergot. And generally, we have a lot of tissue samples that we're starting to see where we have low copper levels earlier in the season. And if we have varieties that are susceptible to getting ergot, we see a lot of ergot in our grain, which is giving us quality issues where elevators are rejecting loads. But anyways, there's a very strong correlation between copper deficiency in those two. And then sometimes it's just general plant health on copper deficiency. But where does that occur? So it's low organic matter or really high organic matter. So if you're under 2% OM, or you're in peat soils, so generally that 8% or higher organic matter. If you have soil pHs greater than 7.5, remember when I was saying earlier about the nutrient interactions, if you have a very high nitrogen application, so we're shooting for high yield wheat, we're putting over, 100, 150 pounds of units of nitrogen. This could actually inhibit copper uptake in the plant because we have an excess of nitrogen within the plant. And then, of course, if your soil test is below 0.4 parts per million. Now, so copper sources, there's a lot of them out there. They could be your fully chelated 7.5% coppers, to foliar coppers like Maxin, to granulars, if it's the LS, so the lignosulfonates, or even just the regular copper sulfates. But just based on work we've done in the past, I'm not going to share a ton of copper data just for sake of time, but what we've found is that we see better response from foliar applications versus, say, an in-furrow with the either granular or liquid forms. It's been that 5-leaf to fully tillered timing and then having a max in copper application is where we've seen the best results. And so, here's just some stuff from the past when we used to have wheat in our answer plots. And so we've seen some really nice responses to copper in soils that had deficiencies in copper when we applied these at that 4 to 5 leaf stage. Here's just another field trial that comes out of South Dakota. This is on winter wheat, and same thing. So we just had different sources of copper. We're seeing nice responses to those. And then even in more recent times, we've got right on our North Dakota, Montana border, we've got that Williston, Sydney, Montana area. We have double-digit increases to just taking a little bit of foliar copper on copper-deficient soils. So we've seen really nice responses to adding copper at that time frame. So boron being another one. Generally what boron does, it has a lot of roles in the plant itself. If that's transport of sugars and carbohydrates, but your big one is pollen germination and pollen tube growth formation, and then the hormonal regulation. So if you have low boron, this is typically what you can see is you don't have good cell differentiation, and it has a tough time growing and it grows slow. So, boron deficiency for us is it's starting to uncover to be a more growing issue. I know for you guys, there's a lot of low organic matter soil, so I think this is maybe more common than it is for us. And maybe you all have a little more experience than I do in this realm. But what we've seen is some foliar applied boron seems to do pretty good. So just different sources of boron, just a little different from copper. We have some crop mixes, some lignosulfonate stuff that has like 1-2% boron in it. You have your boric acids, and then your foliar max in borons. Zinc, another one that rarely do we see the actual deficiency like this, but in a tissue sample, we're starting to uncover these things, and really has a lot of roles, and it's really early on. And so it's enzymatic functions. It helps structurally build proteins. So if you think of proteins are just long strings of amino acids, but it's how they fold onto each other and make a shape that build a protein. Well, zinc is like that bolt or that structural piece that'll hold a bend in a line of amino acids. And that's what actually gives those proteins function in the plant. And so zinc is just a player like that. It's pretty important. So if you don't have enough zinc in the plant, it build the correct proteins. Although it might build the amino acids, it can't get the proteins built correctly to function correctly. But probably one of the biggest things, and that's that phosphorus zinc interaction, is low zinc in wheat will actually induce your shoot growth. So your tillers and your initial stems will actually grow less or become retarded, and will actually start to grow roots more so they can search that out. And so they're actually you're losing shoot growth to the benefit of root growth to try to find more zinc. And the one I never listed in here, like I've been saying, is phosphate. So we put high phosphate levels. This is inhibiting some of our zinc too. So we're starting to, cause some issues with tiller development too. And this is why I think we see like the micro essentials with zinc, and we're seeing so many different blends with zinc added to our wheat starters. I think this is probably one of the biggest reasons, is just keeping zinc and phosphate in balance with each other. So again, zinc sources, there's plenty of them out there. Basic is zinc sulfate, which if you have low zinc, this is just one of the quickest ways to build up your soil levels. But if you're in a high pH calcareous soil, this could easily become tied up too. And so this is where like looking at either a fully chelated or a lignosulfonate that's complexed, that might protect that a little longer, keeping available to the plant. And then there's also foliar versions available too for those different zincs. But enough on fertility. I want to talk population. And so here's where I'm going with this. So I know this is something that we don't have, that I'm aware of, have any cropland wheat varieties available in the P&W, or we're just starting to look at that again. But one thing we do, just like with our corn, is we characterize the wheat we have that we sell in North Dakota, and it's by a response to population. And what we've found is that a response to population is really a response to stress. And so as you increase population, you have more stress per plant because of that increased population and competition. And some varieties handle that really well, just like the corn thing, where you see the same wheat head size and the same spikes for spikelet, all that. But some of them really, really suffer from that. And then you have our low RTP ones that we found that when you plant them at lower populations. So for example, us in North Dakota, we're seeing a lot of 1.6 to 1.8 million plants per acre. That's been a very common live planting population for us. And we have more and more guys, depending on where you're at, trying to increase that more and more. But we're actually uncovering that some of our best varieties we've found through our cropland system actually don't handle that stress well at all and really produce well in lower populations. So dropping it down to 1.1, 1.2 million, and then letting those tillers develop, and those heads will actually flex in size too, where they'll get longer, more kernels, more spikelets per spike, all that. So where I want to go with this is that it's all about stress. And so these high RTP varieties handle stress well, and these low RTP ones do not. And so these are just from our 2020 line that are being sold next year. So just how they're characterized. But here's where I want to go with this, just to keep it really simple. So ways you could variable rate populations and why it could work. Now, so if you place more plants in poor soils, because in poor soils, wheat typically isn't going to tiller anyways, if you utilize a high RTP, so something that handles stress really well, you could get more heads and then essentially more yield in those poorer areas. Now, you could go to your more productive soils and drop population some, or kind of what I'll cover in this next thing is you could have varietal management and manage that by the acre, and then truly plant lower populations where that will flex and do better. One thing here is why I have it as a watch out is that for us, we deal with head scab quite often. And so if we have excessive tillers, that usually sinks, or I should say we're auto sync from when that main head and the T1, T2 tillers will flower versus say like T3, T4 tillers. And if we have that, we can really be in some issues with fusarium head blight. So I know that's probably something you guys don't deal with, but that's why I have this here as a watch out. So anyways, think about it like, you could take a high stress tolerant variety and put more population in poor areas to get more yield. So let's just take this a step further to varietal management. And say we take that same NDVI map that we built the zone map off of and make this really simple. And we have that 5-zone map. We know, how those areas are, how those things yielded, but actually build that into a 2-zone map where we can do, 2 production areas. And so I want to just give you a scenario where we plant this whole field to variety A, which does exceptionally well on good ground, but really, really doesn't do that great in poor soils. And so think about it like this. This is that low RTP variety that I'm essentially talking about, where on good soils, that head can flex, that wheat head can, and it can really add in more kernels. But you get into any, like this field, like I was saying, was all very skeletalized in, shallow soil, very sandy. It's just not a very productive piece of ground. And this is how these things end up doing, you know, where you get an 80 bushel an acre average on your good areas, and then all that sand, you're only getting 25 bushels an acre. So you're averaging, you know, that 58.6 bushels an acre. So let's take it to scenario 2, where we have a variety that is at high stress tolerant, and it does much better on those poor soils, but it doesn't really overproduce on the good soils either. And so this is something we've definitely seen here in North Dakota, is where those steady Eddie varieties, I guess if you want to call it that, they really hold up their yield in poor ground, but we're not seeing the big swings in yield that we are with some of these racehorse type varieties that we're starting to grow. And so you're seeing a very little difference in yield variance. And in this case, if you planted that variety in this field, you're only seeing, you know, 46 bushels versus 58 bushels. So we're seeing a 12 bushel difference in yield just by the different variety we chose. But, you know, what if you put the high stress tolerant variety in the poor soils, which you could get more yield out of, and then you went and put that really productive racehorse type variety in the good soils, and then you try to maximize yield potential that way. And so you could get that full 80 bushel an acre, you know, average out of these areas with the one variety, and then you could get, you know, a 40 bushel average versus 25 bushels in this area. So now we're looking at close to 65 bushels an acre, you know, versus that 58. So we're seeing almost a 6 bushel increase in yield in this one field versus the other, or just by variable planting populations. And so it's an idea. This isn't a clear-cut practice. We're just starting to play with this more and more, especially farther west in North Dakota, where we have a lot of variability, and we're seeing some really nice results out of it. But it's taking a lot of looking on our end to kind of discover, you know, what those varieties, you know, need to be in each of those respective areas. And fungicide management, I think I'm just going to quickly breeze through this since I see I'm kind of burning through my time here. But we do a response to fungicide in our trials. I don't have our 2020 data yet, but I've got our 2019, and we're just looking at a propiconazole at 5-leaf versus a premium fungicide treatment at that 5-leaf stage. And we're seeing, you know, some of our varieties, we're getting more than 6 bushel increase by going to a premium fungicide versus just a propiconazole. And so, you know, this could play into this whole zone thing too, where you could go and let's say that when we were variable rating 2 varieties, we had a low RTF and a high RTF variety 2 that matched with that stress tolerance with something that could really chase yield. You know, if you had the ability, which some of our producers out here have this now, where you can inject directly in the line as you're going through the field and plug this in the maps, you could actually use, you know, where you could put the respective fungicide on the respective parts of the field where you see the return. And so there's this ability to do that too. You know, and that's where the scenario is. So say, hey, we applied Nexicor on all these acres. We knew that the yellow areas, you know, we're going to get our best return. And this is what we saw for net revenue. But if we only applied Nexicor on these yellow areas versus the entire field, we were spending less on that, and we were seeing just a little better return. So just another way to look at this. So really just wrapping up on this, you know, you're taking your varietal management, what we were just talking about, just different ways to manage fertility, fungicide, and populations, and you can bring that all together. You know, now you're getting some wheat management by the acre. So I guess with that, I'll leave that open for Jen or whoever to do polls, and I gotta be able to open this so I can see if there's even any Q&A.
Yep, so what we'll go ahead and do is go ahead and start answering the poll questions, everyone. You will not be able to receive pesticide credits if you do not participate in poll questions, so make sure you do that. Those should be popped up on your screen. If they are not, you should see a little button down by the Q&A and chat that says poll, so go ahead and click that. We do have a question that came in for you, Kyle, so we'll have Kyle answer that question while you guys are doing the poll. Once you're completed on the poll, Kyle will go through the answers on those questions too. So Kyle, the one question.
Sure, yeah.
So the one question that you received was, does soil surface pH influence potential for volatility of urea?
Yes, to some extent it does. I don't know how to quantify that, I guess, off the top of my head. But yeah, generally if we have well, I think it can go both ways, lower or higher pH, you could increase the activity of urease. But boy, that's one I haven't thought on in a while, so maybe I'll get back to you in the chat box on that one. But again, I don't know about you guys, but we're seeing stratified pH issues where we're seeing way more acidic soils in the top 3 inches, and then as we get deeper and deeper and deeper, we're getting back to our normal pHs, which natively are in that 7 to 8 range. But we're seeing our top 3 inches of soil more like, I've even seen down to 4.5 on some of them. And so it's getting really low. And I think that's making our volatility issues speed up even more, which makes this whole how we manage surface applied urea even more important.
Great. Is there any other questions for Kyle? If not, we're going to close down the poll unless anyone needs to pull up a little bit longer. Not seeing anything come through the chat. So Jen, why don't you go ahead and close the poll, and then Kyle can review those questions.
I was like, I hope everyone got the first one right, because I see it's a correct answer in parentheses. On this, but I guess I made some simple questions to cover for this. But at what depth, at a minimum, does urea need to be incorporated to ensure no nitrogen is lost from volatility? It's either through mechanical means, or if you get enough irrigation water or precipitation in the form of rain, it's getting it down where that urea is getting down to 2 inches of soil. Now, as long as you're getting into that depth, most of that urea, as it converts to ammonia gas before it makes its conversion to ammonium, will be trapped in the soil. And then conditions favorable for copper deficiency, just had to select all that apply, and it was the top 4 were all correct there. Or if you had low organic matter, so under 2%, over 7.5 or greater, soil pH, obviously a low copper soil test, and then high nitrogen applications can inhibit, so not necessarily cause the deficiency, but could temporarily inhibit copper uptake into the plant.